This is House Planning Help episode 9.
Have you always wanted to build your dream home? Maybe you know what you want. But what if it could be better? Houseplanninghelp.com. Speaking to the experts, searching for better ways, planning for the future, build a better home. Houseplanninghelp.com podcast.
Hi, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this episode we're continuing on the theme of retrofitting a Victorian house to the Passivhaus standard. We'll look at some of the technical challenges with the help of Alex Rice from Green Tomato Energy.
Houseplanninghelp.com.
Greetings, how are you? And thank you very much yet again for downloading this podcast. I hope you're finding it useful. I'm getting a fair amount of feedback, so that is good, and thank you for it. I've been very busy. I do find it a little bit odd how when I started this, it was just going down the lines of creating my own home, and I seem to have concentrated on Passivhaus methodology quite a bit. I think that's because I found it very interesting and I can see that there is a big future in this. I'm not discounting anything else, I just haven't got there yet. I just got stuck on this one thing. But I went to the UK Passivhaus conference last week, and that was great to see all the UK experts gather at that and to come up with some ideas. Who else could I interview? Where can we go next? So we've got all that. One thing that is troubling me at the moment, at the back of my mind, when I think of the build that I would like to do, if I go for something that is clad in brick or built to a traditional style, as I think I've been saying to you all along, that's just my taste, so I'm trying to keep open, and I can certainly understand why a more modern approach and sustainable approach is good. But the more I learn too, I can see how we've ended up where we have, and examining some of these pictures and some of the designs of the passive houses, it makes sense. So let me give this example, going back to what I would like to do. I'm really confused about whether I follow what I would like aesthetically or give in and try and get used to what you should be doing for a more sustainable house. I can understand that if you want to live in a more sustainable way, it's very simple to create a box and to put wood on the outside, because of course wood regenerates and you can grow it and it can be a sustainable process. But I always like the brick approach, but I can see that when you're cladding, it really adds nothing, and the bricks still need to be fired, so there's energy going into that and transportation across, and then really it's just an unnecessary part of the building. So I'm very confused, and I'd love to know if you're in a similar situation, or if you're looking at these buildings and you're questioning, is that what I really want? Or maybe you love it all the more. I would love your feedback, and you know where to come for that, don't you? Houseplanninghelp.com, all sorts of ways of getting in touch. In fact, we've got a voicemail that we'll be coming to very soon, but right now it's time for the main content.
Houseplanninghelp.com, the interview.
I'm here with Alex Rice from Green Tomato Energy. He's the senior engineer, and we're going to look at some of the technical challenges today of retrofitting a period property. Hello, Alex.
Hi.
So I'm somewhat apprehensive doing this because you are the technical brains of this, and I foolishly am going into the technical challenges, and I know that they're often quite difficult to grasp. So first of all, be gentle. And then maybe you could just talk us through, we are doing an episode about retrofitting a Victorian property. Mm-hmm. When you start out in this process, what do you have to do?
Well, I think there's a couple of things you have to do. One is the human aspect of it, is to understand the needs of the client. And very often you have a situation where there are two clients. There's very often husband and wife teams. And actually quite a big portion of it is to understand and to help people understand collectively what it is they're trying to achieve from their building. Because in order to get a clear brief, people have got to have a clear understanding of what it is they're trying to do, and they've got to be together in that. So educating and talking and allowing people to express ideas about what they'd like to do with their building is a very, very important first step, a non-technical first step to getting the building project started. And then from that, you figure out what energy performance you're aiming for. You set an energy target. In the projects we work on, that is usually either Passivhaus or Enefit. Enefit being the 25 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year, the slightly more lenient standard geared up for retrofit projects. Although with buildings where there are more constraints, particularly listed buildings, we will set an energy target that is higher than that. But it is very important to nail down that energy target, because without knowing what you're trying to achieve in energy terms, it's almost impossible to make the technical trade-offs that are required to say, do you insulate the walls more, or do you have better performing windows? It's really that energy target that guides all of those decisions. So it's absolutely critical that that energy target is decided and it's stuck to throughout the build process, because changing that changes practically the entire design. And then the other thing is, very often we're working on retrofit projects. So a very important thing, as well as understanding the client, is to understand the building itself. Each building you come to is unique, and that's in many ways is what makes retrofit so interesting from a technical point of view, because for a new build you just need to understand the way conventional materials work, whereas for a historic, an old building, you've also got to understand how this building was intended to work when it was first built. Victorian buildings function in a very different way to a modern building in terms of the way moisture moves around the building and the way they're ventilated and the way people lived in them. So in order to take that building as it was designed and make it work in a way that is almost completely different, you've got to have a really good understanding of the materials and the methods of construction that were used.
You mentioned moisture there, which I don't fully understand yet, but I know it's a big issue. You don't want to trap the moisture, do you?
Moisture is death to a building, basically. Nothing kills a building more quickly than it being wet. If you look at derelict buildings, they'll stand for ages until the roof falls in, and then they'll fall to pieces very quickly. Basically, moisture causes wood to rot, it causes bricks to undergo freeze-thaw damage. The primary aim of a building is to keep your building materials dry, and controlling sources of moisture, both from within the building and outside the building, is crucial to the long-term survival of any building. Not specifically low-energy buildings, but any building.
Stupid question alert here. Why is there moisture in a building in the first place?
Well, there's moisture in a building because it's got people in it, and people do things like cook and wash and dry their clothes on the radiators and things like that, or water-potted plants, all sorts of sources of water inside the building. And then the other source is water outside of the building, so rain falling on the walls, water soaking up through the foundations, leaking out of gutters, coming in through roofs, potentially if you've done a really terrible job on your roofing. So those are the sources of moisture. That's where the water gets in.
You started out by telling us the process that you go through, and you set your energy target first. Why would you not just say, I want the best target?
Well, because the best target depends on the building and depends what you're trying to achieve. So if by the best target you mean zero energy consumption, your house would be infinitely big. It's not actually possible. So trade-offs have got to be made between how thick your insulation is and what energy sources are available to provide heat. So, for example, if you have a passive house that has very poor orientation, so you can't get some south-facing windows, then your insulation is going to need to be thicker in order to make up for that. There's a trade-off between how much energy the building consumes, how expensive it is to build it, how much space it takes up, and how costly it is to service the building. So the concept of passive house is that you make the building envelope perform well enough that you can dispense with some of the techie bits of the building, parts of the heating system. So that is the whole point of the 15 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year, is that is a point of minimum cost for that level of performance. And then the same principle applies to the Enefit standard, basically because in a retrofit project, getting the insulation in and getting the thermal bridges insulated is more costly. So it becomes cost effective to spend a little bit more on the energy and a little bit less on the building. So those 2 points, 15 kilowatt hours per metre squared and 25 kilowatt hours per metre squared, were picked carefully as a best level of energy performance. But built into those two numbers is assumptions about how much it costs and how difficult it is to achieve those standards. So which is why when you go to things like listed buildings, that number moves up, because it becomes cost effective and practically achievable to consume a bit more energy per year, but make it much easier to build the building.
So space is clearly going to be one of the issues. We're sitting in a Victorian property, but I know, being the owner of a Victorian property myself, I do not have as much space as this. How do you go about finding that space? We've got a certain amount of equipment that fits very neatly into the basement in this building, doesn't it? But each project is going to be different. And is there a solution for every project?
Well, one aspect of it is that is often brought up is that in a passive house, you can sit right against a window or right up to a wall. You've got much more flexible use of the space available. So although you may be losing a few 100 millimetres on the inside of the walls, you are potentially not actually losing that much in terms of the practically usable area of the building. It's also my experience that you can put a surprising amount of insulation on the inside of a room, and that once it's all detailed in, you hardly notice it. When you're first putting it on, it looks huge. It looks very noticeable. But when it's detailed in with the plasterwork all done, it really does disappear. The exception to that comes in buildings which are really small, where you get things like beds no longer fitting, wardrobes no longer fitting into spaces that they previously did. So that is an area where you start to have to be a little bit more cunning about what types of materials you use. There are higher cost ways of achieving the same level of insulation performance in less thickness. You can use aerogel, vacuum insulator panels, that kind of thing. But that really is an exception. Generally speaking, phenolic foam and those type of insulation materials are perfectly adequate and are the most cost-effective choice for retrofit projects. Then the other aspect is that if you're doing something to a passive house or an Enefit standard, you're probably renovating the building at the same time. And this is a stage at which a lot of people choose to extend the building. I mean, this building has about the same amount of floor area as when it started, but that's because it had a basement was dug out to provide space for the services. And there was a rear extension on the back of the property that created a kitchen, and in fact, I think it might have more area than when it started. Basically, you have an opportunity to extend the property if that's practical within the space you have.
What are the biggest technical challenges when you come to design this and then implement it?
The biggest technical challenges in a retrofit are working around the existing structure of the building. Because in a new build, you make your walls with your insulation in it already, and it's quite easy to design a thermally bridge-free, well-insulated envelope. In an existing building, you will very often have areas of the building which are geometrically difficult to insulate. So that is one practical challenge. The other is, in a lot of existing buildings, you will have timber in the walls. It's typical in Victorian construction to, if something is roughly brick-sized and brick-shaped, you can stick it in the wall, certainly for internal leaves of walls. So when you take the plaster off, as Tom mentioned in the previous interview, you find all kinds of gremlins. So making sure that the pieces of the building that you're covering up are in a fit state to remain covered up behind insulation for the next few decades is a small practical challenge. I suppose really what I'm getting to is that there are actually relatively few technical challenges to doing a passive house. Most of the problems are technically solved, and it's a question of working out how to apply those solutions to your building.
And then making sure that they are done efficiently in the process.
Yes.
So let's go through those practical elements then that you see as key challenges.
So we talked about getting the builders on your side, and the universal lament of people trying to build passive houses in the UK is the difficulty of finding tradespeople who are skilled and, most importantly, interested in the project. And a lot of what I do in my daily life as an engineer for these projects is a process of establishing a communication with the people who are on site. My background is very practical. I can actually do many of the the things that are required, and that is terrifically important in building credibility with the guys on site. You haven't got a chance of being taken seriously when you say that such and such a detail has not been done adequately if you can't yourself do it and demonstrate on site how it ought to be done. And then the other aspect of it is a communication thing. Build a team atmosphere within the project so that when issues come up on site, the guys will call you and say, hey, we found this thing, it doesn't look quite right, it's not working how we expect. Whereas if you have an adversarial culture where if they call you, they're expecting to get an earful of criticism about how they're not doing their job right, that completely will kill the project. So I'm a sort of part technical, part therapist almost, to get people who've been doing the same thing the same way for years and years to do something differently without alienating them. Green Tomato Energy is interesting because we attempt to build very low energy buildings, and we successfully build low energy buildings using the skills available, using UK tradespeople, materials available in the UK, buildings that were designed in the UK and built to typical UK standards. We, through a combination of education and clear communication with the guys on site, we get the project delivered with the resources available.
Is it the case that there are more of these skilled tradespeople every day that goes by, or are you struggling to find them for each job?
I mean, I suppose there are more skilled tradespeople because there are more and more of these projects being done. I mean, one of the biggest indicators that a tradesperson is likely to be good is that they've actually done a project like this before. And actually, tradespeople are becoming aware of this. And you get people who want to do a Passivhaus project because it would be good for them to be known to be able to deliver to that level of quality. Passivhaus is becoming a quality mark, like a mark of good building practice, in a way that Code for Sustainable Homes isn't really, because there's such a focus on quality in the Passivhaus process and such an understanding that the devil is in the details, that the whole team is watching the site and flagging up problems as they arise. And it's that process of the site being overseen by somebody who knows what things should look like, and then flagging up the problems and showing the guys on site how to correct it. And it's actually terrifically rewarding. One of the things before I got into this position was airtightness testing and thermography of buildings. So I've seen a lot of airtightness defects, and it's actually rather a fascinating process. My childhood hero was rather Sherlock Holmes, and I actually view my role a bit like that. I'm sleuthing around a building trying to find the problems, and it's a fun process. And actually, when you get a blower door in a building and you get the guys and you take them round the building and you show them, so here's what you did, and here's where the air's coming in, and here's why it didn't quite work, and here's how you can fix it, they're quite excited because you get to see so having a blower door test makes something that was invisible visible. You can see the air coming in, and the same kind of applies to thermography. You can say, well, here's a patch where heat's coming through because that insulation wasn't quite installed correctly. And people actually, it's quite heartening. You turn up on site at the beginning of the day, and quite often people are a bit sullen, they're suspicious of you, they're not sure what you're going to do. And at the end of the day, you leave site and people are excited about this new thing they've learned. And that's really enjoyable as a professional.
I think I've done this all the wrong way round in the interview, but maybe we can conclude on how you got into this. What was the draw for you as a professional to find this line of work?
So I graduated with a degree in new and renewable energy engineering from Durham, and I'd always imagined myself, putting up wind turbines in the North Sea. And through a sort of series of factors, I ended up working in the United States, in Virginia, for a company called Commonwealth Solar. And I had the pleasure of having as my boss a gentleman called Ken Schall, who had been part of the passive solar homes movement in the United States in the 1970s. And he'd built a foam and concrete, it was actually a geodesic dome, very hippie, or part of it was anyway. And he'd built it for next to no money, and it used practically no energy. It was built with very basic building techniques. And as someone who'd lived in Victorian buildings my whole life, I went into this space. I was just astounded by the sensation of calm and the light, and it was comfortable. And it was just a complete eye-opener that the way we've been building buildings, not only is it not efficient, but there are tons of other reasons why you would want to build a better building. And I'd always thought of low-energy buildings as complex, expensive. You go to things like the Centre of Alternative Technology, and what's very much on show is what I would call eco-bling, all of the bits and pieces and gubbins that make it work. And what Ken really showed me was that none of that's necessary. Make the building well insulated and airtight, and you will need the minimum of stuff to make it work. And then I came back to the UK, and I wanted to continue that process. Whereas in the US, houses are built and they're knocked down every 25 to 50 years. The average life of a building on construction in the UK is in the hundreds of years. So there's a massive, massive need for retrofit in this country in order to take the building stock that we have and we love and turn it into the building stock that we would like to have in the future. And that provides all sorts of interesting technical and human challenges, and that's been a very rewarding line of work for me.
Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Another industry expert on houseplanninghelp.com.
You'll find the show notes to this episode at houseplanninghelp.com/9. And Alex Rice, I think he's a man to watch. He's still quite young, but I reckon he's going to go a long way. Alex has also talked me through how I can calculate the delivered energy for the space heating that I have in my own house. And at some point, I'm going to turn that into an article as well. And hopefully you'll be able to give it a go with the information, and we'll see how we get on. Some more news. We're very close to having our first guest blog live on the website houseplanninghelp.com. So watch for that. I'll let you know in the next podcast. I think it should be ready by then, and what the topic is. And a call to action. I want you to let me know how your project is going, if it's up and running. And we do have a voicemail message which you can do. I'll tell you how you can do it afterwards, but let's have a listen. This is Shauna Rada Estrada, who tells us about what she's been up to.
I myself have just completed a renovation of a Victorian house in Catford South, and it was a great project, and we really wanted to do in a lot of eco-sensitive aspects about it. So we've put in sheep's wool insulation in the loft and in the cellar, and that has made an amazing has had an amazing effect on our bills compared to our neighbours, who are always complaining how expensive their gas bills are, whereas we've got a wood stove which we use in the evening, so we never have the central heating on, and that was the same as last year. We've part double glazing, part old Victorian windows. What else have we done, which is trying to do lots of eco stuff. Can't think anything for the moment, but anyway, I'm going to go into this every now and then and see what you're up to, but definitely sheep's wool insulation. It's worth the investment.
Shauna, thank you very much for your feedback. I enjoyed listening to that, and it did sound like your project had gone well, so we'll take on board your advice. Incidentally, when I went to see if we'd had any more survey replies, the amount had doubled, so I've got all sorts of other ideas that you've given me of where you would like this podcast to go, and we will just keep on at it, exploring different avenues and see how we go. If you'd like to leave a voicemail message, as Shauna did, it's very simple. When you're on the website, on the right-hand side of the page, there's a microphone icon and it says send voicemail. You can record your message. I think you get the option to redo it if you're not happy with your take, and I can always edit it at this end. So don't be afraid to get in touch and let us know how your project is, or maybe if you've got some great tips after concluding your project. Next time on the podcast from houseplanninghelp.com, we speak to Roger Hunt. He's co-author of the Old House Handbook, and he's doing a second edition which is all about energy efficiency. So of course, a perfect place to go to, and then we'll move on from this subject. So until next time, take care.
You've been listening to Ben Adam Smith on the path to build a better home. Sign up now to the free email newsletter. Head to houseplanninghelp.com.